Victoria Sterling lived in a world of privilege where money could buy anything, or so she thought. At 35, she was the CEO of a successful tech company in Manhattan, with an enviable penthouse overlooking Central Park and more wealth than she could spend in 3 lifetimes. Her sleek office tower dominated the skyline, a testament to her ruthless determination and rejection of what she called fairy tales and foolish beliefs. But there was one thing that marred her perfect view: St. Michael's Church, a Gothic structure that stood defiantly across the street from her building. The sight of it made her blood boil. Every day she watched people stream in and out, their heads bowed in prayer, their faces filled with hope she considered pathetic. "Look at them!" she would sneer from her floor-to-ceiling windows, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her crystal whiskey glass. Wasting their lives praying to thin air while the world passes them by. Her executive assistant, Sarah, would quietly lower her eyes, having learned long ago not to engage when Victoria went on her anti-religion tirades. Victoria's contempt for faith wasn't random. It stemmed from a childhood marked by tragedy and what she saw as the ultimate betrayal. Growing up in a poor family in rural Kansas, she had watched her deeply religious parents pray fervently while struggling to make ends meet. Their house had been filled with religious icons, Bible verses on the walls, and the constant murmur of prayers. When her younger brother Tommy fell ill with leukemia at age 6, their parents spent hours in church, begging for a miracle instead of working extra hours for treatment money. "God will provide," they would say, clutching their rosaries, while Tommy grew weaker by the day. Victoria, then 12, had watched in helpless rage as her brother slipped away, her parents' faith seemingly blind to his suffering. Tommy died at age 8, his small hand clutched in Victoria's as she promised herself she would never be fooled by the empty promises of faith. She left home at 18, worked her way through college, and built her empire through sheer determination and calculated ruthlessness. Her success became her vindication. She had made it to the top through hard work, not through prayers and belief. The church across the street particularly infuriated her. St. Michael's was a historic building that served the community, running a soup kitchen and shelter for the homeless. Victoria had tried multiple times to buy the property, planning to tear it down for a new office tower. Her offers had grown increasingly generous, but Father Thomas, the elderly priest who ran the church, always declined with the same gentle smile that made her want to scream. One rainy evening, Victoria was working late, reviewing acquisition proposals, when she heard singing floating through her supposedly soundproof windows. The church choir was practicing, their voices carrying through the storm. Something about the melody struck a chord deep within her. It was "Amazing Grace," the hymn Tommy had loved to sing in his hospital bed. Still believing in angels even as the disease consumed him, the unwanted memory sent her into a rage. Storming out of her office and across the street, she burst into the church during choir practice, her $1,000 heels clicking aggressively on the marble floor. The singing stopped abruptly as everyone turned to stare at the elegant woman radiating fury in their sacred space. "Do you have any idea how disruptive your singing is?" she demanded, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Some of us are trying to work instead of indulging in pointless rituals." Father Thomas approached her calmly, his weathered face serene. "Ms. Sterling, everyone is welcome here, even those who come in anger." His gentle response only fueled her rage. The acceptance in his eyes reminded her too much of Tommy's unwavering faith even at the end. "Well, I don't want to be welcome here," she spat. "I want this ridiculous building torn down. Your God isn't real, and you're all fools for believing in him. Where was your precious God when my brother was dying? Where was he when my parents chose prayer over getting real help?" The choir members gasped at her blasphemy, but Father Thomas remained unruffled. "You carry great pain, my child. I pray that you'll find peace." Victoria laughed harshly. the sound bouncing off the stained glass windows that depicted scenes of mercy she no longer believed in. "Save your prayers, old man. They're worthless, just like your faith and this crumbling building. I'll show you all how powerless your God is." As she turned to leave, her eye caught a small boy in the choir, around Tommy's age, watching her with a mixture of fear and pity. For a moment, her step faltered. Something in his expression reminded her of her brother's last days. Back in her office, Victoria poured herself a double whiskey, trying to shake off the encounter. But the boy's eyes haunted her, along with the memory of Tommy's voice singing that same hymn. "I'll prove them wrong," she muttered, staring at the church through the rain-streaked windows. "I'll show them all how powerless their precious God is." Little did Victoria know, but her outburst at the church that night would set in motion a chain of events that would shake her carefully constructed world to its foundations. The universe, it seemed, had decided it was time to teach Victoria Sterling an unforgettable lesson about faith, love, and the true meaning of power. As she sat in her office, plotting her next move against the church, fate was already weaving a tapestry of circumstances that would force her to confront not just her disbelief, but the deep wounds that had created it. A week after Victoria's outburst at St. Michael's Church, her carefully structured world began to unravel. It started with a phone call that made her blood run cold. Her company's biggest client, a multi-billion-dollar tech corporation, was pulling their contracts due to leaked emails showing Victoria's plans to exploit security vulnerabilities in their systems. "This can't be happening," she whispered, staring at her computer screen as more devastating news poured in. The stock price of her company was plummeting, and investors were demanding emergency meetings. Victoria had built her empire on cunning and sometimes questionable practices, but she'd always been careful to cover her tracks. Sarah, her assistant, entered the office with a grim expression. "Ms. Sterling, there's something else." She handed Victoria a stack of papers. "Someone anonymously sent these to every major news outlet in the city." Victoria's hands trembled as she read through documents detailing years of tax evasion, corporate espionage, and illegal business practices. Within days, her world crumbled. The FBI launched an investigation, board members resigned, and clients fled en masse. Victoria watched helplessly as everything she'd built through years of ruthless determination disappeared. Her corporate enemies, long waiting for a chance to strike, moved in like vultures. Late one night, as she sat alone in her darkened office, Victoria heard that haunting hymn again, drifting from the church. The same melody that had triggered her outburst now seemed to mock her downfall. Through her tears, she noticed movement in the church. The same little boy from the choir was helping Father Thomas set up beds for the homeless shelter. The sight struck something deep within her. Here was this child, probably from a poor family like she had been, giving his time to help others instead of being bitter about his circumstances. Just like Tommy had always tried to help other sick children in the hospital, even when he was suffering himself. A knock at her office door jolted her from these thoughts. It was her lawyer, Richard, looking grave. "Victoria, they're issuing an arrest warrant tomorrow morning. The evidence... It's overwhelming. You're looking at serious time." She felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Prison? Her? "How did this happen?" she whispered. "There's more," Richard continued. "Your assets are being frozen. All of them. The penthouse, the cars, everything. They're moving faster than I've ever seen. Someone very powerful wants you taken down." Victoria thought of all the people she'd stepped on to reach the top, all the lives she'd ruined in her pursuit of success. Was this karma finally catching up? With nowhere else to go, her so-called friends having abandoned her at the first sign of trouble, Victoria found herself wandering the rainy streets of Manhattan. Her designer clothes, once a symbol of her success, now felt like a costume. She passed by St. Michael's Church, where light still spilled from the windows despite the late hour. Against her better judgment, she climbed the stone steps and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The church was quiet except for Father Thomas, who was straightening prayer books in the pews. He looked up as she entered, water dripping from her expensive coat. "I've lost everything," she said, her voice breaking. "Are you happy now? Is this your God's revenge?" Father Thomas slowly approached her, his face showing not triumph, but compassion. "God doesn't seek revenge, my child. Sometimes we need to lose everything to find what truly matters." Victoria laughed bitterly. "What matters? I worked my entire life to escape poverty, to prove I didn't need faith or prayers to succeed. And now—" She collapsed into a pew, sobs racking her body. "I'm going to prison. Everything I built is gone. I'm right back where I started." Father Thomas sat beside her, his presence somehow comforting despite her lingering anger. "Perhaps this is not an ending, but a beginning. You ran from your pain for so long, Victoria. Built walls of wealth and power to protect yourself, but healing can only begin when we face our wounds." As if summoned by his words, the small choir boy appeared from the back of the church. "Father Thomas," he called out, "Mum's asking if you need help with—" He stopped short when he saw Victoria. In the candlelight, his resemblance to Tommy was even more striking. "This is Michael," Father Thomas said softly. "He lost his father last year, but still comes here every evening to help with the shelter." Victoria felt tears well up again. Michael approached them, holding out a small, worn Bible. "When my dad died, I was really angry too," he said. "But Father Thomas taught me that sometimes God's biggest blessings come disguised as our worst moments." Victoria took the Bible with trembling hands, opening it to find a familiar passage highlighted, the same verse Tommy had loved to quote in the hospital. The walls she'd built around her heart for decades began to crack, letting in a glimmer of something she'd thought long dead: hope. As she sat in that quiet church, Victoria began to realize that perhaps losing everything might be the key to finding something far more valuable than wealth or power. But her journey was far from over, and the hardest lessons were yet to come. Victoria spent her first night in prison, staring at the concrete walls of her cell, still in shock at how quickly her life had changed. Her designer clothes had been replaced with an orange jumpsuit, her luxury penthouse swapped for a 6x8 cell. The Bible Michael had given her sat unopened on her small metal desk, the only personal item she'd been allowed to keep. The initial hearing had been brutal. Evidence of her crimes was overwhelming, and the judge had denied bail, citing her substantial resources and flight risk. The media had a field day with her downfall, dubbing her the fallen queen of Wall Street. Newspapers splashed her mugshot across their front pages, detailing how the infamous God-mocking CEO had finally gotten her comeuppance. But something unexpected happened during those first few weeks of incarceration. Without the distractions of wealth and power, Victoria found herself confronting the pain she'd buried for decades. At night, memories of Tommy flooded back, not just of his illness, but of his unwavering faith and gentle spirit. She remembered how he'd comfort other sick children in the hospital, sharing his toys and telling them about angels watching over them. One particularly difficult night, unable to sleep, Victoria finally opened Michael's Bible. A small note fell out, written in childish handwriting. "When my dad died, this helped me understand that sometimes God's love shows up in unexpected ways." She began reading, starting with the passages Tommy had loved. To her surprise, Father Thomas visited her regularly. He brought news of the outside world, including updates about Michael, who had asked about her. The elderly priest never preached or condemned. He simply listened as Victoria gradually opened up about her past, her anger, and her growing confusion about everything she'd believed. "I don't understand," she confessed during one visit. "I was horrible to everyone. I mocked faith, hurt people, broke laws. Why do you still come here? Why does Michael care what happens to me?" Father Thomas smiled gently. "Because grace isn't earned, Victoria. It's given freely, especially to those who think they don't deserve it." Meanwhile, something extraordinary was happening outside the prison walls. Michael, moved by Victoria's story, had convinced his choir group to take action. The children started a letter-writing campaign, sharing how her story had touched them and expressing forgiveness. These letters, filled with innocent wisdom and unconditional acceptance, began to soften Victoria's hardened heart. But the real miracle came through an unexpected source. A young investigative journalist, digging deeper into Victoria's case, discovered evidence that she had been set up. While her business practices had been unethical, the most damaging evidence had been fabricated by a consortium of rivals who had conspired to destroy her. When this news broke, Victoria's case was reopened. Her sentence was reduced, though not eliminated, acknowledging both the conspiracy against her and her genuine crimes. But Victoria surprised everyone by accepting responsibility for her actions rather than trying to minimize them. "I did wrong," she told the judge at her resentencing. "Being framed doesn't erase my choices. I want to make amends." She agreed to testify against the conspiracy, helping authorities uncover a widespread network of corporate corruption. During this time, Victoria experienced what she could only describe as a spiritual awakening. The Bible stories she dismissed as fairy tales began to resonate with deeper meaning. She saw herself in the parables of lost sheep and prodigal sons, understanding for the first time the transformative power of forgiveness. Father Thomas and Michael continued to visit, and Victoria found herself looking forward to their discussions about faith, redemption, and the possibility of starting over. She began to see her imprisonment not as punishment, but as an opportunity for profound change. One day, Michael brought her a surprise, a recording of the choir singing "Amazing Grace," Tommy's favorite hymn. As the familiar melody filled her cell, Victoria finally allowed herself to cry for her brother, not in bitter anger, but in grateful remembrance of his beautiful spirit. "Tommy always said God works in mysterious ways," she told Father Thomas, wiping her eyes. "I think I'm finally beginning to understand what he meant." The priest nodded, seeing the genuine transformation in the woman who had once mockingly stormed into his church. But Victoria's journey was far from over. As her release date approached, she faced the daunting prospect of rebuilding her life. Not as the powerful CEO she had been, but as someone very different. The lessons she'd learned behind bars would be tested in the free world, where redemption stories aren't always welcomed with open arms. Yet, she felt a strange peace about the challenges ahead. The Bible Michael had given her now showed signs of frequent use, its pages marked with notes and reflections. She had found something in her fall from grace that all her wealth and power had never provided, a genuine sense of purpose and connection. As she prepared for her release, Victoria knew her greatest test still lay ahead, proving that her transformation was real, not just a jailhouse conversion. But this time, she wouldn't be facing it alone. She had found a family in the most unlikely place, a humble church across from her former office tower. After serving 18 months, Victoria was released from prison on a crisp autumn morning. Father Thomas and Michael were waiting outside the gates, a sight that brought tears to her eyes. She had entered these walls as a powerful CEO. She left them as someone humbled, but somehow stronger. "Welcome back," Father Thomas said warmly, embracing her. Michael, now a year older, but still reminding her powerfully of Tommy, handed her a small bouquet of flowers. "The choir wanted to be here too," he explained, "but Father Thomas said we shouldn't overwhelm you on your first day out." Victoria had lost nearly everything: her company, her penthouse, her fortune. The restitution payments and legal fees had depleted her remaining assets. But she had gained something far more valuable: a genuine faith that had transformed her from the inside out. Father Thomas had arranged temporary housing for her in a small apartment above the church's community center. It was modest, nothing like her former luxury penthouse, but to Victoria, it felt like a sanctuary. From her window, she could see her old office tower, now owned by one of her rivals. The view no longer filled her with bitterness. Rebuilding her life proved challenging. Despite her business expertise, her criminal record made finding employment difficult. Many former colleagues shunned her, not just for her crimes, but for what they saw as her religious conversion. Victoria faced their skepticism with a new kind of strength, drawn from her growing faith. She began volunteering at St. Michael's Soup Kitchen, working alongside the same homeless people she had once wanted to displace by tearing down the church. Their stories of struggle and survival touched her deeply, reminding her of her own family's poverty during Tommy's illness. One afternoon, while serving meals, Victoria recognized a familiar face. Sarah, her former assistant, now homeless after the company's collapse, had rippled through the lives of its employees. The shame Victoria felt was overwhelming, but instead of running from it, she embraced it as an opportunity for redemption. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I never thought about how my actions would affect others." To her surprise, Sarah didn't reject her apology. Instead, they talked for hours after the soup kitchen closed, and Victoria learned how many lives had been impacted by her downfall. This conversation sparked an idea. With Father Thomas's guidance, Victoria began using her business knowledge to help others. She started teaching financial literacy classes at the church, helping people manage their money and avoid predatory lending. She worked with former inmates to develop job skills and rebuild their lives. Michael continued to be a constant presence in her life, his innocent wisdom often striking deep chords. One day, while helping her organize a job fair for ex-offenders, he asked, "Do you still miss being rich and powerful?" Victoria considered the question carefully. "I miss the security," she admitted, "but I don't miss who I was. I thought power meant controlling others, but real power is being able to help them instead." Michael nodded sagely, reminding her again of Tommy's old soul wisdom. Gradually, Victoria's new life took shape. Her classes became popular, drawing attention from local media. Some business leaders, impressed by her commitment to giving back, began offering job opportunities to her students. The church's programs expanded, touching more lives in the community. But the true test of her transformation came when she discovered the identity of the person who had orchestrated her downfall. James Morrison, a rival CEO she had once ruthlessly outmaneuvered, had coordinated the conspiracy that sent her to prison. In her old life, Victoria would have plotted revenge. Now she chose a different path. She requested a meeting with Morrison at St. Michael's. When he arrived expecting either threats or pleas, she surprised him by offering forgiveness. "What you did was wrong," she said calmly, "but it led me to find something far more valuable than anything I lost." Morrison left that meeting visibly shaken, not by her words alone, but by the profound change he witnessed in the woman he had sought to destroy. Within weeks, anonymous donations began arriving at St. Michael's, supporting their community programs. As Victoria watched the church's influence grow, touching more lives and healing more hearts, she finally understood what Tommy had tried to tell her all those years ago. God hadn't abandoned them during his illness. He had been preparing her for this moment, this purpose, all along. Father Thomas, observing her work with pride, often reminded her of their first hostile encounter. "You came to tear down these walls," he would say with a gentle smile. But God had other plans. Sometimes our greatest defeats become our greatest victories. Victoria's story began spreading beyond their community, attracting attention from people seeking their own paths to redemption. She welcomed them all, sharing her journey from mockery to faith, from power to purpose, from success to significance. Yet her greatest joy came from the simple moments, praying with Michael and the choir, serving meals to the homeless, teaching others how to rebuild their lives. In losing everything, she had found what she had been searching for all along: peace, purpose, and a faith that could move mountains. 5 years had passed since Victoria's release from prison, and St. Michael's Church was celebrating a remarkable transformation. The once struggling parish had become a beacon of hope in the community, largely due to Victoria's dedication and innovative programs. The building she had once tried to tear down now housed a thriving community centre, offering everything from job training to addiction recovery support. On this particular Sunday morning, Victoria stood before the congregation, her heart full as she watched Michael, now a teenager, lead the choir in Amazing Grace. The boy who had reminded her so much of Tommy had grown into a compassionate young man, carrying forward the legacy of faith and service that had changed her life. Father Thomas, though older and using a cane, still served the parish with unwavering dedication. He smiled proudly as Victoria began her testimony, a story she had shared countless times but never tired of telling. 5 years ago, I thought I had lost everything, she began, but God had to empty my hands of worldly wealth so they would be free to receive His blessings. The church was packed, not just with regular parishioners, but with many of the lives Victoria had touched through her work. Former inmates who had found jobs through her program sat beside business leaders who had once shunned her. Sarah, her former assistant, now ran the church's financial literacy program, helping others avoid the pitfalls of poverty. Victoria's parents, reconciled with their daughter after years of estrangement, sat in the front row. Their relationship had been rebuilt slowly, healing old wounds through understanding and forgiveness. They had finally been able to mourn Tommy together, finding peace in the knowledge that his faith had ultimately led his sister back to God. As Victoria shared her journey from mockery to ministry, she noticed a familiar face in the back of the church: James Morrison, the man who had orchestrated her downfall. He had become a regular donor to the church's programs, though this was his first time attending a service. Their eyes met briefly, and she offered a gentle smile of forgiveness. "My brother Tommy used to say that angels were everywhere," Victoria continued, her voice strong with conviction. "I didn't believe him then, but now I see them every day, in the recovering addict who helps newcomers stay clean, in the ex-convict who mentors troubled youth, in the business leader who offers second chances to those society has written off." Ooh. The community centre had become a model for other churches nationwide. Victoria regularly traveled to speak about their programs, sharing how faith-based initiatives could transform lives. Her story of redemption inspired others to believe in the possibility of change, no matter how far they had fallen. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from Michael, who had followed in Tommy's footsteps in ways Victoria never expected. "You know," he told her after the service, "when I gave you that Bible in prison, I was just doing what I thought my dad would have done. He always said everyone deserves a chance to find their way back to God." Victoria hugged him tightly, remembering another young boy who had never lost faith even in his darkest hours. "Tommy would be proud of us," she whispered, looking up at the church's stained glass windows where sunlight streamed through in rainbow patterns. "He always knew God had a plan." That evening, as Victoria locked up the community centre, she paused to look at her old office building across the street. The empire she had built there seemed like a distant memory, replaced by something far more valuable: a life of purpose, faith, and genuine impact. Father Thomas joined her on the steps, his weathered face peaceful in the setting sun. "Did you ever imagine," he asked, "that God would use your attempt to destroy this church as the very means to save it, and you?" Victoria shook her head, smiling. "He does work in mysterious ways," she replied. "I wanted to tear down these walls, but instead, he tore down the walls around my heart." She thought of Tommy, imagining his joy at seeing his sister finally understand the truth he had known all along. As they walked back into the church for evening prayers, Victoria felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had lost an empire of wealth, but gained a kingdom of purpose. Her brother's faith had not been in vain. It had planted a seed that grew through years of bitterness and pride, finally blooming in the most unexpected way. The evening light filtered through the stained glass, casting a warm glow over the pews where lives were changed daily. Victoria took her place beside Michael and the choir, ready to sing the hymn that had once triggered her rage, but now filled her heart with peace. God had indeed given her an unforgettable lesson that true power lies not in mockery or wealth, but in the humble acceptance of divine love and the joy of serving others.